Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. This month, we're looking at employment status and the gig economy, because there's been a huge amount of media coverage of this over the last year, and it would seem to remain firmly in the spotlight. So we're going to take a look to see what all the fuss is about, and as usual, we will aim to give you some practical pointers to remove any potential risk to your business. My name is Alison Blackhurst. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions, and I will be leading the session this afternoon. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sue Watson, our HR Operations Manager. Good afternoon, Sue.
Good afternoon, Alison, and hello, everybody else. Alison, could you just share your screen with us, please? I don't think that's currently visible.
Oh, right.
So while you're just sorting that, just to let you know, you all have a question panel. So if you do have any questions during the seminar, then just send them through to us. I'll try and answer them if I can. Otherwise, we will get to them at the end of the session if there's time. And if not, we'll respond to them directly afterwards. We will be recording this webinar, and so they will be available afterwards within the next few days once we've had chance to convert them. If you would like a copy of the slides, just let us know and we can sort that as well. Thank you.
Right, can I just check with you, Sue? Can you see my screen now?
I can.
You
yeah.
should be able to.
Yeah, that looks
You can. Oh, brilliant. Lovely. Oh, fine. So everyone's got the glorious picture of both of us. Wonderful. Just what they wanted. Right. Okay, so in which case we will carry on then. Yes. So, employment status in the gig economy. Now, what is all of this about? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what is the gig economy. So I looked this up on Google, and what they said is it's a labour market characterised by the prevalence of short-term contracts or freelance work as opposed to permanent jobs. So what we're talking about here are all types of workers who are earning by taking on lots of short-term tasks, often with no guarantee of work, and where the work is usually, but not always, but usually coming in at very short notice. And often this work is sourced through online platforms, typically ones such as Freelancer, Upwork, Clickworker, People Per Hour, Handy, TaskRabbit, MyBuilder, and Mop. And probably the best known, largely because of the amount of media coverage that it's attracted, is of course Uber. Now, you're probably wondering why I've put a picture of a Victoria sponge cake on this slide. Apart from the fact that it's making me hungry, the issue really is that we all want to have our cake and eat it. So on one hand, we have employers who are struggling to meet 24/7 demand without increasing their overheads. So many of them are going to seek to use the lowest cost option to do this. At the other end of the spectrum, as employees, we traditionally look to our employers to provide work and a regular income. But many employees now also want flexible hours and the ability to work as and when they prefer to do so. They do not want Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 jobs. So again, employees and employers. And in the middle, we have consumers. And as consumers, we love and we're increasingly demanding the increased availability of shopping and deliveries. And we're always looking for lower prices. So all of us are wanting to have our cake and eat it on this. Now, flexible working practices can give employers the ability to increase and flex manpower to meet unpredictable customer demand, but they have clearly been abused by some employers or misunderstood. Let's be charitable here. But this has resulted in significant reputational damage to the businesses involved, and also loss to the employees, many of whom are lower paid and don't necessarily understand their employment rights nor how to enforce them. And of course, tribunal fees do mean that in some cases, employees may not be able to afford to do so. Or if you're looking at just purely holiday pay, for example, it may not be worth the cost outlay to lodge a claim. And this issue is not just black and white. It's not just about everybody wanting to have their cake and eat it. Different people want different things. And negative comments about 0 hours contracts or self-employed status tend to disregard the fact that many people don't want traditional full-time employment. They positively want casual or flexible work because it suits their lifestyle. Uber's had a lot of negative criticism, but when it surveyed thousands of its drivers, just over 3/4 preferred being self-employed, and only 16% of the respondents said that they would actually prefer to be employed. So the difficulty really is getting the balance right. Now, as I've said, last year saw a huge amount of media coverage, and this was about some of our well-known employers. Now, first of all, we had Amazon, which attracted the attention of the Sunday Times around about last Christmas. Now, Amazon claims that it pays more than the minimum wage and that it is fully compliant with employment law. But the journalists criticised what they said were its draconian practices regarding breaks, the number of miles that people walked around its warehouse. I don't know if they compared that with postmen, by the way, but anyway, number of miles that people were walking. And it published pictures of workers camping out in the cold weather before Christmas because they said they couldn't afford the travel costs of getting to and from their home and the site. Amazon did actually offer discounted travel. It subsidized the travel, but normally travel costs of getting from where you live to where you are working, you would expect that to be the responsibility of the employees. So you read some quite emotive coverage there, and you have to ask whether it was fair or not. Hermes is a delivery company with couriers, and there is currently an HMRC investigation going into it. There were complaints from 98 couriers who all claimed that they were earning below the national minimum wage. Now, the drivers for Hermes were sent letters from HMRC at the beginning of this month asking them to provide evidence and asking for things like their written contract and pay slips, and also to agree to a 1-hour interview each. And HMRC said this will help them to decide what the employment status is or was. And at the end of January, the GMB union also announced that it had taken this particular case up and was to launch legal proceedings, which we understand it has now done. So it has launched its employment tribunal claims. And then finally, of course, in terms of news coverage, Sports Direct. I mean, who cannot have heard of Sports Direct now, even if you never buy sports equipment or clothing? Sports Direct was accused by MPs of operating as a Victorian workhouse. And I'll say a little bit more about Sports Direct later, but we also read criticism of the practices of newer firms, such as Uber and CitySprint, which I'll be talking about more. And as a result of all of this, we have a whole raft of cases that are now underway regarding employment status and its associated rights. And the media are happily giving some very dramatic and emotive coverage to these. It's not always accurate, as many of you will know. In terms of new cases, well, we have Deliveroo. Now, the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain made a formal union recognition request to Deliveroo, who rejected this. So the union has referred the claim on to the Central Arbitration Committee. Now, the CAC has to determine the employment status of the couriers before it can determine whether the union should have recognition rights in relation to these people. And it will be doing that on the 24th and 25th of May. And in the meantime, Deliveroo has made some compromises on some things. Firstly, it committed to removing a clause in its contract that banned its workers from contesting their self-employed status at employment tribunals, because the legality of this clause was questioned by a group of employees and was deemed to be unenforceable. So in its new supplier agreement, Deliveroo specifies that the freelance couriers can work for other businesses and they don't have to wear Deliveroo branded clothing. And the contract was shortened to 4 pages because the Work and Pensions Committee labelled the contract offered by Deliveroo and others, such as Uber, to be unintelligible. And the takeaway food delivery service has also been accused of creating new vocabulary. Now, I don't know what that is, but apparently it issued managers with a list of words to use to ensure that they didn't accidentally use terms that indicated that the motorbike riders and cyclists were actually employees. So that's Deliveroo. The doctor's laboratory now, the case is being supported by the same union, i.e. the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain. And this is a claim by a group of couriers who deliver emergency blood supplies to hospitals and also samples to laboratories. And they claim that they are employees. So they're not claiming, not only are they saying we're not independent contractors, they're saying they're employees, not workers, and therefore entitled to employment rights. And the union is also supporting action against eCourier, XL, and Addison Lee. DX, now that's gone to ACAS Conciliation. This is another courier company. I have to ask, is there a trend here? But DX is involved in ACAS Conciliation with the GMB union, and it is refusing to accept that the drivers are workers, not self-employed people. Now, the courier firm determines the routes that the drivers use to deliver the parcels, and drivers are unable to refuse to deliver parcels which are put on their daily schedule. The rate of pay is determined by DX, and it's not usually negotiable. If the ACAS conciliation is unsuccessful, in the courier's view that is, then the case will be submitted to an employment tribunal. TDL, again, are the couriers employees? The couriers are required to work regular shifts, which are dictated by the company. They have to ask for time off. They're not allowed to refuse deliveries, nor are they allowed to take on outside employment whilst they work for TDL. And they're claiming full employee, not worker status. Then we have DDP and Parcelforce, well-known names here. Now, press reports say that the couriers who are ill and who are unable to find a replacement themselves to cover for them face a financial penalty of up to £150 in the case of the DPD drivers and £250 for the Parcelforce couriers. DDP has asked HMRC, firstly, to confirm that the franchisees are truly self-employed and are not its employees. But we do have to note here that being self-employed for tax purposes is not necessarily the same as for employment legislation. So because tax legislation doesn't have the category of worker in the middle, you're either an employee or you are a self-employed person. Now, apparently about a quarter of Parcelforce's 3,000 couriers are self-employed owner drivers and the rest are employees. And the self-employed ones are paid per delivery and they provide their own vehicles and fuel, insurance and uniforms. So when they're off sick, the penalty charge is intended to cover the cost to Parcelforce of finding a replacement courier. But because they earn about £200 for a shift of 12 hours or more, the penalty can see them lose £450 in total in earnings for each day that they're ill. And one of the couriers has said that the decision whether to charge the sick drivers the penalty or not was entirely at management discretion, which implies that some drivers are penalised while others aren't. Now, Parcelforce organises the rota for the self-employed drivers. It requires them to undergo 3 days unpaid training. But the drivers are contracted to ensure the services are provided, but they are not required to provide them personally. They're allowed to appoint substitutes, and they agree to cover the cost of fulfilling their routes if they can't do it themselves and can't send cover. So this is quite an interesting one, as their terms do seem to cut across all of the traditional boundaries between the three different categories. And the latest case, reported on the 12th of May, is the eCourier one. Now, eCourier is a subsidiary of Royal Mail. It's not a small company. It has a turnover of 22 million in 2016. And a bicycle courier, Demille Flanore, was classified as an independent contractor, so was told that he wouldn't get any holiday pay. His union argued that he wasn't a self-employed contractor because, similar to the Uber case, he was instructed what to do by a controller. He also was required to work exclusively for eCourier, All the jobs were booked and allocated to him by eCourier, and eCourier set the prices that were charged to customers and also decided what it would pay him. Now, this case was settled for £545, so that is not a lot of money, bearing in mind what he was asking for was holiday pay. But in terms of the implications for eCourier and a lot of other businesses, it's going to be a lot more than that. Now, eCourier has 350 delivery drivers, and almost all of them are on the same terms as Mr. Flanore. The union has called on them to immediately guarantee worker status to all of the couriers. And the company has previously warned that if they had to call the couriers workers, this would increase their costs. And in the latest annual report, the directors said that the principal risk to the business was if employment tribunal judges ruled that the couriers were workers and not independent contractors. So although we may be looking at odd employees bringing relatively low value claims for each particular claim, the overall picture is a much, much broader one, and there are big repercussions for all of these companies. And whilst most of the above cases relate to drivers and couriers, it's not just about drivers and couriers, of course, it's all sorts of workers. So why do we have this confusion? Well, employment law currently differentiates between three different separate groups. At one end of the spectrum, we have employees who have full employment rights. In the middle, we have this group called workers, which is largely misunderstood by a lot of people. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have self-employed, who are totally free agents, responsible for their work and for their earnings. They decide what they're going to do, and they work under their own steam. Yeah. Let's take a closer look at each of these three, and then maybe we can work out where the confusion has come from. First of all, an employee. Now, an employee is an individual who has entered into or works under a contract of employment. And a contract of employment is quite different to a contract to provide services, which you would use for a self-employed contractor or consultant. First of all, not only the terms in that contract of employment apply to this person, but also common law duties apply to them. And these are things like the duties of confidentiality, good faith, and the duty of care. Now, these are all implied in employees' contracts, which is a contract as a servant. Yeah, old-fashioned terminology, but that's where it all goes back to. And in general, you're going to have an employee if, first of all, you have a duty to provide work to this person, or to pay them if there's no work, even if there's no work to be done, and if the individual personally has a duty to perform the work. So they can't send somebody else to do the work, yeah? You guarantee them work, you must provide them with either work or at least pay, yeah? And they're expected to turn up and do it. Also, you will control how the work is done. Now, this may involve very precise directions on how to do the work, but where you have highly skilled employees and managers, you're more likely to leave much of that to the discretion of the individual employee. But at the end of the day, an employer can always overrule the individual as to how or when a job is to be done. And if it's not done to the employer's satisfaction, it may exercise disciplinary powers over that individual. You can't do that over a self-employed person. Employees are integrated into the organization. They should have a contract or some written documentation which stipulates terms such as the hours of work, their paid holiday, sick pay, disciplinary procedures, etc., including notice periods. They receive sick pay, they receive holiday pay and pension contributions under auto-enrollment. There may be a staff handbook or collective agreement which governs the individual's work. And the employer typically will supply the resources, the tools, the equipment, or the clothing to do the work, and also will organise formal induction and training for that person. And crucially as well, the employee pays either wages or salary and will make deductions for and payments for tax and national insurance on the employee's behalf. And basically, in terms of what the employee is up to during the working day, the employer takes all of the risk on that. So that's an employee. A worker, the person who sits in the middle ground, and this is not to indicate that employees don't do any work, it's the standard joke about that, but a worker is not a new concept. The concept of a worker came in the Employment Rights Act 1996, so that's 21 years ago. And the Act defines a worker as an individual who has entered into a contract of employment or any other contract under which they undertake to perform personally any work for another party to the contract whose status is not that of a client or customer. Workers used to be fairly rare, but the category is becoming more common, and this person sits in the middle between employees and the self-employed. So the term worker includes not only employees, but also anyone who has a contract, whether it be express or implied, under which he undertakes to do or perform personally any work or services for your business, but where you're not a client or a customer of any profession or business undertaking carried on by that individual. So workers may not necessarily be employees, but nevertheless they do have some rights, such as the right to be paid the minimum wage, the right to paid holiday and breaks under the working time regulations, and they're also protected against whistleblowing. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have a self-employed individual. And typically, someone is more likely to be self-employed. It's not a case, by the way, of ticking a certain number of these boxes. It's a case of looking at the overall picture. These are indicators, yeah? So basically, if you're in business for yourself, you can work for more than one employer at the same time, doing the same or similar work. You can employ others, and you're not required to do the work personally. You can decide what work to accept or reject, so it's up to you what you do. A self-employed person should not be promised regular work by your business, and that person should not depend on you to provide it. They're a service provider to your business and not part and parcel of your organization. So the self-employed person will take on a particular job and can decide how, where, and when the work is done. They make their own provisions for sickness and holiday absence and pensions and everything. Typically, they send you an invoice when the job's finished, and they are paid a fee, which is negotiated between you and them, without any deductions being made for tax or national insurance. And usually, but not always, self-employed people will be responsible for their own expenses. Now, they may be registered for VAT purposes, and crucially, they take a degree of financial risk and responsibility. So if they do a job badly and they have to redo things, or if it takes them twice as long as they thought it was going to do it, they run that risk and they incur the cost. And conversely, if they do a brilliant role and they do the job in half the time, they would still get paid the same fee, so they benefit from their speedy and efficient performance. Normally, they will provide their own equipment, and they may maintain their own stock with which to do the work. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, so why does this all matter? What does it matter what people are called? Well, it matters firstly because of the increased rights that apply to employees, and therefore the increased costs and liability on employers. If you are going to take a few thousand people who you've been calling self-employed and suddenly decide that they're entitled to holiday pay, that's going to be a large cost for your business. And it also matters to the government, because with more and more people in self-employment, tax income and also employer national insurance contributions are reduced. And the TUC published a report that found that the Treasury loses more than 75 million a week through the abundance of low-paid and insecure jobs. So clearly the government want employers to be doing the right thing, but they also really would like more people to be in employment rather than self-employment, because that's going to create more revenue for them. Now, I tried to do you a nice little form which actually showed you the difference between the rights of employees, workers, and self-employed. I'm not going to go through each line individually, but by putting the ticks and crosses in different background colours, hopefully this demonstrates visually to you the difference in rights between each category. And as you can see, the self-employed only tick one box on that, yeah, whereas employees tick all of those boxes. There seems to be quite a lot of confusion between casual workers and 0 hours contracts. So let's have a quick word about them before we go on to talk about some of the cases. Yeah. Now, casual workers are workers who are only used on an occasional ad hoc basis. And typically, like agency workers, they will be used to provide cover at short notice or during busy periods. They are normally employees during the periods that they actually work for you, but although they're protected by employment legislation in many areas, this is very limited because employment rights build up with continuity of service. And if casual employees have breaks between assignments which break their continuity of service, then they're not going to be building up lots of employment rights. The key point with casual workers is that there should be no mutuality of obligation. Now, what that means is that the worker shouldn't be obliged to accept any work that's offered to them, but should be free to decide whether to accept each engagement that you offer. And equally, on the other hand, the employer shouldn't be obliged to provide any work. Whilst they're not working, it may well be that there's no obligation between the employer and the individual concerned, but this doesn't affect their rights whilst they are working. So the Employment Tribunal has said that the fact that there's a lack of any mutual obligations when no work is performed is of little, if any, significance when determining the status of the individual when work is performed. Where you have to be very careful with casual employees, though, is that if you offer work on a regular basis and an expectation builds in that you're going to be offering work and also an expectation on your part that that person is going to accept it, then what you can end up with is an overarching contract which links the periods of work, even if there's an express clause in the contract which stipulates that there's no obligation to offer or accept work. So casual workers should not be used on a regular, routine basis, and there should be no expectations on either part that they're going to turn up and do some work. Now, 0 hours workers may be offered work on a self-employed basis, or they can be offered an employment contract, but it's an employment contract that doesn't actually guarantee any hours. Unlike a casual contract, where there's no obligation on either side to offer or accept work, an employee on a true 0 hours contract may be obliged to remain on call and to be available for work during stipulated hours, but is actually only paid for the hours that they actually work. So what would normally happen is that the worker's contacted at the beginning of the week or the week beforehand and told what hours they're needed, although some of them may also be required to be available on call. The employee isn't entitled to be paid the minimum wage for the time that they spend on call because they're not on the premises, but clearly they are restricted by the requirement to be available for work and to be handy. So 0 hours contracts, where they've got the bad press, is that they're not considered best practice if the requirement to be available prevents that person from undertaking other work because they don't have any guarantee of either payment or work. And in the past, some 0 hours contracts used to require the employee not to work elsewhere at all. So that totally limited the opportunity to make up the earnings on the days or times that they're not required, and such clauses are now unenforceable. So main difference between the two, mutuality of obligation. With a casual worker, you should not have mutuality of obligation. With a 0 hours worker, you have the obligation on the employee to be available to undertake work at the specified times, but no guarantee of work, and also continuity of service, which would typically be broken with casual workers, provided that there's a break of at least a week between assignments. But with your 0 hours workers, they would typically carry on being employed throughout the whole contract, even if they don't do any work from week to week. Now, I hope I haven't confused you so far, and I hope that you're thinking, well, that seems fairly clear. I've got 3 separate boxes. I know which box is which. The difficulty is that the confusion has arisen because there's no comprehensive legal test of what constitutes an employee, a worker, or a self-employed person. mainly because the courts have said that each case should be considered on its own merits. So the courts will start by looking at the documentation that you've got in place, and if you've got robust agreements, then that's all very good, that spell things out clearly, but then they actually look at what actually happens in practice and to see whether that's consistent with the contract. And what very often happens is that whilst the individual's contracts might have been right at the beginning of the working relationship, what originally started out as ad hoc, irregular work as and when needed, has been supplemented and it has grown into a pattern of regular work, and the employment status has evolved into more of a part-time or even a full-time arrangement. Also, you find that many employers are confused about tax status, and they don't realise that being self-employed for tax purposes is not necessarily the same for employment legislation, because as I said earlier, tax legislation doesn't have the category of worker in the middle. And many people who work in the gig economy work shifts and they work variable hours, and things alter quite a lot. And whilst the obligation on either side may exist once work is offered and accepted, there's not necessarily mutual obligation between shifts. Now, without that mutual obligation, there is no worker or employee status for the intervening periods. And so the accompanying employment rights and protection are lost. So the key concepts to bear in mind all the way through this are mutuality of obligation and is there a requirement to perform the services personally. You cannot have an employment relationship if there is no mutual obligation to provide and undertake work. Employees are expected to turn up and work the hours that they're contracted to work. And where someone has genuine freedom to send a substitute, then there cannot be an employee or worker status because workers are required to perform the services personally. So I hope that helps to clarify that anyway. Now, for those that want to take a closer look at the three main key cases that we've been covering recently, first of all, we have the Uber case, which received an awful lot of media coverage. And in that case, the drivers were found to be workers. Now, this was a landmark case because Uber has 40,000 drivers, and it classes all of these drivers as self-employed and calls them partners. And what happens is that somebody that wants a taxi ride uses their smartphone to book a driver using the software in the passenger and the driver's phones. So there is an Uber app, and the app is connected to the passenger's credit card, and the journeys are charged on a distance and a time basis. So Uber takes the money, not the driver. It deducts a referral fee from the money it takes, and then it pays the remainder over to the driver. And the drivers all use their own vehicles and they pay for their own fuel. Now, Uber argued very strongly that its drivers were self-employed individuals and that they all ran their own businesses because they could use the app as and when they wanted to, and they have total flexibility of being able to work when they choose. But the tribunal said that, come on, Uber is a company that actually provides transportation services. And when the drivers have the Uber app turned on, they're under the control of Uber because the app determines the journeys that the drivers accept, it determines the routes, and it determines the fares. When the driver is within the authorized working region, and they're able and willing to accept assignments, they are workers at that stage. The drivers are not operating independent businesses for the simple reason that they have no contract with the passengers who are the end users, and they don't negotiate the fares. And also the drivers are required to perform the services personally. So at the end of the day, the work is offered and accepted on Uber's terms and conditions, even though the drivers have flexibility as to when they work. So the tribunal said no, the drivers should be categorised as workers and therefore they're entitled to the minimum wage and they're entitled to holiday pay. Now, Uber is appealing against this and a decision won't be made until later this year, probably in September time. The initial case was brought by 19 drivers and apparently there are now around about 60 claims and more are expected. So we watch this space on that one. At the same time, Uber's facing a number of other challenges. The GMB union is saying that if Transport for London doesn't guarantee more rights for the Uber drivers, then it's going to seek a judicial review of the licence, because Uber's negotiating at the moment for the renewal of its taxi driving licence. Now, it had a 5-year licence, it wants another one, and the GMB is saying, look, if you can't sort this, you shouldn't really give them any more than 6 months at this time. And basically, the union is saying that the current business model in London is necessitating the drivers working excessive hours, which are to the detriment of the health and safety, not only of the Uber drivers in London, but also of other road users. So that's an interesting one. And just trying to give this presentation a lighter side, Uber also got a lot of negative media coverage because a French driver blamed it for his marriage breakup. Now, you might think, well, why are they responsible for that? But it's all to do with the way the app worked. And this driver's suing Uber for £38 million, i.e. 45 million euros, because what happened was he borrowed his wife's iPhone and he used it to log into his Uber app. And the app had a bug in it, which resulted in the details of all of his journeys being sent to his wife's phone, even after he'd logged out of that phone. And his wife was suspicious that he was being unfaithful, and the driver is claiming that the bug cost him his marriage. That's an interesting one. And then there was also media coverage when the chief executive of Uber swore at one of his drivers after the latter had complained that his income was falling because of Uber's fare structure. And the CEO ended up having to send an email of apology, hugely apology to all of the staff, where he said he was ashamed of his behavior and admitted that he needed to grow up. So generally speaking, Uber is not having a very happy time at the moment. But anyway, as we say, that case goes to appeal around about September time. Now, Dewhurst v City Sprint UK Limited, again, this involves a courier, a bicycle courier in this case, who was found to be a worker. She was described as a self-employed individual, and her agreement said that there was no obligation on City Sprint to provide her with work, and also no obligation on her to accept work. So what we were saying earlier about the mutuality of obligation clearly didn't apply there. Yeah. Any periods spent not working were unpaid, and that she got no paid holiday, maternity, or sick pay. But when the tribunal actually looked at what happened in practice, they found that Maggie Dewhurst actually worked pretty well always, a regular pattern of hours, 4 days a week, and she worked between 9:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. every day. Every morning she logged in and she spoke to a controller, and she logged onto an online tracking system, which then determined her deliveries, and it tracked her movements throughout the day. She used City Sprint's equipment, and she was given a uniform. And although the couriers were expected to use a self-billing system to get their payment, in reality what happened was that City Sprint automatically calculated their payments and paid them in arrears every week, each Friday. Now, the Employment Tribunal decided that the service agreement, therefore, was not in line with the true nature of the working relationship as it was in reality, and that actually Ms. Dewhurst was a worker. City Sprint have also lodged an appeal. And finally, the case of Pimlico Plumbers versus Smith. So this is not a courier, okay? And in this case, the plumber was found to be a worker. Now, Mr. Smith had worked for Pimlico Plumbers for 6 years as a self-employed plumber. And sadly for him, he had a heart attack. And following this, he asked if he could reduce his working hours from 40 hours a week to 3 days. And his request was refused. Now, does that go hand in hand with self-employed status, where you are your own boss and in charge of what you do? Now, it was quite an interesting case because the tribunal accepted that actually quite a lot of the boxes for self-employment were ticked. Firstly, Mr. Smith could negotiate the price of jobs. He employed his wife. He decided when the work would be done, and he was paid on receipt of invoices. He accounted for his own tax, and he was VAT registered, and he provided his own tools, equipment and materials, and he had his own insurance. So on the basis of all of that, you think, okay, that sounds like self-employment. Yes, it sounds as if he's in business on his own account. But the tribunal found that he was a worker because he was required to provide the services personally. he was under an obligation to work 40 hours each week. So he could choose when he worked those hours, but he was expected to agree them with the company, and he was expected to do 40 hours. He didn't have the right to appoint a substitute, and whilst he provided estimates and prices for the work done, he was an integral part of the business, and he was under the employer's control in a lot of ways. He used a van provided by the company, and although Pimlico wasn't obliged to provide any work if none was available, the tribunal felt that it wasn't a client or a customer of Mr. Smith's business. It was a principal. So they said, no, he's a worker. It went on appeal to the Employment Appeals Tribunal in Great Britain, who also agreed that Mr. Smith was a worker. And they said there was nothing in writing that gave him an absolute free right of substitution, and he was expected to undertake the work personally. So yes, he could swap shifts and organise his own pattern of work. So he had a bit of freedom as to when he actually did the work, but he had to do it. And then it went to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal also upheld the decision. And they basically said that if an individual has the right to send a substitute, and they can send whoever they want, provided that person is suitably qualified, then they're unlikely to be a worker, because that's not consistent with the requirement to do the work personally. But if actually they're able to send a substitute, but they can only do that when they're unable to do the work themselves, i.e. when they're ill, for example, or the substitute has to be approved in advance, so on an approved list, for example, then that might not necessarily be inconsistent with the requirement to provide the services personally. So again, Pimlico Plumbers intends to further appeal the decision. So can you see a common theme to all of this? Basically, this is all about employers calling people self-employed and basically not having to give employment rights, and then these people saying, actually, the way that I'm working at the moment, I think I really should have holiday pay, and I think I should be paid the minimum wage. And some are going further and saying, well, I should actually be an employee. And what's surprising about all of this, and the reason that it's hitting the news, is the scale of the problem. Self-employment is estimated to account for 45% of new jobs created in the UK since the 2007 to 8 financial crisis. So almost half of new jobs. And recent research by the TUC has found that the number of people who don't have guaranteed hours or baseline employment rights has increased by more than 27% over the past 5 years. So that's why this is becoming an issue. The gig economy currently accounts for 15% of all independent workers, and an awful lot of people are trying to get work through an online app or platform. Now, this can be work that they could do at home. So 80% of the people in research done by University of Hertfordshire were looking for online work that they could do at home, and they were using platforms such as Freelancer, Upwork, Clickworker, People Per Hour. Now, this is work that they can do anywhere if they can do it at home. So effectively, they're operating or competing in a global market, perhaps setting themselves up and quoting against workers in India, Eastern Europe, America, other parts of the world, where they don't have the employment legislation that we have in the sense of the minimum wage and the working time regulations. Yeah? So you're competing against these workers. Yeah. There are also people who are looking for work that they do offline, such as cleaning or carpentry or gardening. Now, obviously, because that's in other people's premises, that's more likely to be undertaken within the UK. And the platforms for that are things like Handy and TaskRabbit, MyBuilder, Mop. Yeah. And then you have people who are looking for work as drivers for companies like Uber or BlaBlaCar. Even higher levels of people are either freelancing, working temporarily, selling items on eBay, or driving an Uber on top of their normal jobs. Now, McKinsey's looked at all of this, and their report found that 40% were using the platforms to supplement their income. So they already have other jobs, but they're doing work on top. Yeah, 30% were actively choosing to work independently and earned their primary income via the sites. 16% were doing extra work because of financial need. And just 14% were earning their living in this way, but actually would prefer a traditional job. So we're talking about an awful lot of people who are getting work through these apps and people who are using the apps, and it's a major issue. Is it new? No. These forms of working are not new. It's the scale of the use that's new. So you have employers who are increasingly having longer opening hours and quicker delivery models, yeah, and they're trying to find ways of aligning what is very unpredictable demand with supply. And so they've turned to what they think are going to be more flexible and lower cost ways of doing this than having to hire full-time employees who could just be standing around for ages not doing anything. 0 hours contracts, as I said before, have been around for years. Yeah, the only thing that's actually different about them is that employers can no longer rely on them for exclusivity clauses. Yeah, and in some ways, whilst the gig economy uses up-to-date technology and seems very, very modern in the sense of using apps to locate and deliver, etc., it is actually a traditional form of work. It's like piecework, but where the amount of work can be very unpredictable, very uncertain, can come in at very short notice, and usually, but not always, as I said before, it's paid at low rates. But it's not new. The problem is the level of misunderstanding about it and the lack of enforcement. Many of the claims that I've discussed already are backed by unions because individuals who might be low earners might be reluctant to pay the cost of bringing employment tribunal claims themselves, especially if their employer, in inverted commas, then decides to stop using their services altogether. So there's currently little fear of legal penalty for the businesses that continue to pay low piecework rates, i.e. per delivery, because the supply of available labour is high, so they can easily get alternatives. And the cost of bringing tribunal claims can put people off low value claims, particularly such as holiday pay claims. So the sting to this really is the damage to the employer's reputation and the fact that now we are all much more aware of firms like Sports Direct and like Uber than we probably were before. So the government has had to get involved with all of this because it's been concerned about genuine exploitation of workers and an erosion of basic employment rights. So before the general election was called, what we had was a committee of employees that were looking at this issue, led by Labour's Frank Field. So it's a cross-party committee. Yep. And firstly, they accused companies of writing contracts in gibberish, making it hard for the workers, particularly the ones that had limited English skills, to understand the terms that they were signing up to. And Field also argued that a recent scheme to make Uber drivers pay for their own sickness insurance was yet another way of pushing costs onto the workforce. So he produced a report. It was called Sweated Labour, Uber and the Gig Economy. And it quotes testimony from 83 drivers who said that they often took home significantly less than the national living wage after they'd paid their running costs. So clearly there's a problem. So what the government did was it therefore appointed Matthew Taylor, the former head of the No. 10 policy unit, to review the rights of the people working in the gig economy. Now, we're still awaiting his recommendations, which are expected this summer, and he's looking at exploring various ways of making it easier for these workers to have rights to pensions, the minimum wage, and holiday pay. So the sorts of things that he's been considering are making it mandatory for temporary workers to receive written terms and conditions within a week of starting jobs so that they don't miss out on their rights. Requiring companies to report how many temporary workers they use, that's under consideration. They've also suggested introducing an online government tool that would help workers to determine their employment status. And basically, if the tool reckons that the person isn't self-employed, then the burden of proof would be put onto the employer to disprove that in an employment tribunal. So something like that could help reduce concerns that employers are wrongly classifying people as self-employed in order to avoid legal responsibilities and cut the tax liabilities. So we have the Taylor Review, and then we also, at the same time, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy launched its own inquiry into the future of work. Now, that consultation is now closed, but apparently they received dozens of submissions. So we had people like the CPD calling for greater awareness of employment rights and saying that businesses should be required to provide terms and conditions to all workers, not just to employees. Yeah, we had some suggestions for additional legislation or guidelines guidelines aimed at offering greater clarity, because you still get a lot of business advisors and accountants who wrongly suggest that business owners and/or individuals can choose their status. And we've had calls on our helpline from clients where they've rung up and said, my employee has asked me if he can go self-employed because he would like to do so. Can I just simply do that? Is that okay? And you look at it and you think, okay, you're retaining that employee without giving any cost, and they will get the benefits of the tax and national insurance savings, and also the employer has the tax of savings on national employer contributions. But actually, at the end of the day, if nothing else is changing, no, you can't simply rebadge somebody as something else, especially if it's not the correct badge. Yeah? So the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed suggested that the government should look at introducing a freelancer limited company status. So something that possibly would be similar to IR35, but that would actually offer certainty on tax and employment status whilst also protecting revenue. And the Office for Tax Simplification liked that suggestion. Now, there are other views. Some said, look, it's clear anyway what people should be, but what's needed is better enforcement of the rules. Some said, oh, you ought to get rid of remove worker status altogether because that's what confuses the issue. But of course, that could make it harder for people who are currently classed as self-employed because the gap between them and employees would be higher. And then we have the election manifestos. Now, Labour is promising a ban on 0 hours contracts, and it wants to move the burden of proof in the gig economy so that the law assumes a worker is an employee unless the person states otherwise. And the Conservatives are committed to cracking down on abuses in the gig economy. So clearly this is something that's not going to go away. And the last suggestion, which I only read yesterday, I'm so hot off the press, yeah, was a proposal for a new national minimum wage rate for employees on non-guaranteed hours. Now, the rationale behind that is that if an employee is not guaranteed hours, then they need to have a higher rate of pay to accommodate the fact that they can have hours reduced without warning. Yeah. Obviously, if that did come into force, it would make 0 hours contracts much less attractive, and especially if there was a minimum number of hours for a 0 hours contract. In some countries, you can't have contracts for less than 5 or 10 hours, so that's quite an interesting one. So clearly we're going to have some change. So where do we start on all of this? As I've said before, some of these cases are going to appeal, so we don't know what the outcome is going to be, although it does seem more increasingly apparent that actually the government and the courts are more on the sides of employment rights and not on people getting away with not giving the rights that they should be doing to their workers. So the trend is against the business models that seek to have the same control over individuals that they would have if they were employees, but that actually pay and tax them as if they were not. So the first step is ensure that your working arrangements are clearly documented, but bear in mind that increasingly the courts use a factual matrix of behaviour to determine an individual's employment status. So in reality, what happens in practice is going to take precedence over anything that you have in writing. So the risk is always going to be that self-employed people move further down the spectrum towards either worker status or employment status, resulting in quite large financial exposure to unpaid holiday, pensions and other entitlements, and particularly if you've got a lot of workers involved here. Yeah. So, and you've got to bear in mind as well that the amount of media attention, which has sometimes been very dramatic and sometimes incorrect, yeah, and the confusion about employment status may well lead to an awful lot of people questioning their own status and their own earnings and saying, well, am I not getting what I should be getting here? So what we would suggest is, first of all, given the number of tribunal claims on this subject and the negative publicity, take a close look at any people that you have, freelance staff, contractors, or anyone whom you currently consider not to be employees, and actually stand back and say, might they actually be workers? Are they required to do the work personally? Might they even, in reality, be part-time employees? And if in doubt, use the current HMRC tax tool and also the guidance above. Yeah. If you think that they are workers, then review the terms on which you use them and check your compliance with the national minimum wage and the working time regulations for these people and the requirement to give statutory paid holiday. Now, check your documentation is clear and easy to understand, especially if you use workers who don't speak English as their first language. Yeah. Frank Field reckoned that Uber's contracts were gibberish, so don't fall into the same trap. We want the workers to actually understand what the terms are and ensure that any agreements like this don't have unfair terms that seek to prevent these people from accepting work elsewhere or that seek to prevent them from bringing a claim to contest their status. And if you do have any penalties for failure to perform, and these are quite rare actually, don't forget that your workers must receive the minimum wage for each pay period. And once you've looked at legal compliance, also think about morale and motivation. Yeah. And take care that casual agreements make it clear that each period of work is regarded as a separate period, and where there is no work, this is not regarded as a temporary cessation. Once you've got all of that done, check that the terms that you've set out in these agreements are actually consistently applied. And unless the circumstances have changed and your needs are now more predictable and you are happy to offer these people part-time or full-time employment, then, consistently apply your agreements by ensuring that the working patterns do not develop over a period of time into a regular pattern or a different relationship that was never intended. So you're going to need to have a large enough bank of employees that means that you're not reliant on key regular workers, and so that you can actually alter the working patterns and ensure breaks in their continuity of service. And a break has to be at least a week, running from a Sunday through to a Saturday. The danger always is that you get a few workers who are particularly good, they're very reliable, they're very keen, they never turn work down, and so therefore the easy option is to keep giving them the work. But then they're used more and more and more, and they eventually morph into employees. So mutuality of obligation is key. Do you expect that person to turn up, and do they expect to be required and paid? So make all your offers of work to them formally, preferably confirmed in writing rather than being any assumptions. Yeah. If there's a clause which allows the worker to turn down work, then it's very sensible to actually make sure that this is used, i.e. by offering work which is turned down, and keep records of where work is offered and refused. And don't apply your normal employment procedures to these people where they don't apply. So, for example, workers may well be entitled to paid holiday, yeah, but because there is no entitlement to or no obligation on them to accept work, they don't have to request annual leave. They just have to tell you when they're taking it. Now, for self-employed people, if you want to make sure that they are genuinely self-employed, then first of all, if you use lots of these individuals for the same type of work, then it's likely that they're not going to be able to negotiate their terms individually, because you're going to have one set rate of pay for all of them. So in that case, try to ensure that you have as many as possible of the other indicators of self-employment that we talked about before. Don't offer so much work to these individuals that they become reliant on you. Check that they also work for other people. Don't integrate them into the organization, so they shouldn't be on your sales and your marketing material or amongst the contacts on your website as key service deliverers. And if they have a substitution clause in their agreements, do try to ensure that this is used and make a record of it. And don't agree to requests from staff who want to become self-employed if effectively they're going to be doing exactly the same job for you. Because you might save on their national insurance contributions, you might want to retain their services, and feeling that allowing them to be self-employed will enable them to save on their tax and NI, and it's not going to cost you anything. But it's not a good way of saving costs, and it is a highly risky strategy. So in summary, therefore, the concept of a worker is not new. Self-employment's been around for centuries. Piecework isn't new. Yeah. What is new is the scale on which these are being used. Yeah. competition is not just delivery companies. There are people offering work, professional services through all of these routes, and all manner of services such as gardening, housework, cleaning, dog working, through to writing contracts, developing websites, designs, and developing apps, even to things like contracts for architectural plans. Yes, so it covers the whole range of activities. But exploitation is only really when individuals have no choice. So let's not forget that these ways of working do suit some individuals in some circumstances. And finally, arrangements that are clearly dressed up as something else are highly risky and are going to increasingly be open to challenge. So do get it right. Any questions so far on all of that? Anything anybody would like to ask? I am aware that we're running very tight on time.
I think it'll be probably easy to deal with most of them offline because of the we've had one or two through. One that's perhaps just a quick one. Hopefully, somebody who has CIS workers. Some of them work about 10 months of the year and some all year round, and they want to make them PAYE. So they're asking what sort of contracts we would recommend in those circumstances.
Okay, so you have them for 10 months of the year, and then 2 months of the year you have no requirement for these people, presumably. So in that case, firstly, you could look at fixed term contracts, which would work well for the ones that are only needed for the short periods, yes. But you do need to be very careful with fixed term contracts, because what you don't want is this umbrella overriding agreement where there's an expectation that you're effectively laid off for 2 months and then you're going to be coming back, yes. So fixed term contracts only if you need them for short periods, and then you may not be bringing the same people back again. For 10 months of the year, what you might want to look at, particularly if you want to retain these staff and they're good people, is something like an annual hours contract. And under an annual hours contract, you would actually be requiring them to work 10 months of the year and to take 2 months off altogether, yeah, but you would actually phase their pay over the entire year, and that could be a sensible means of retaining staff by utilizing them when they're needed, but averaging their payout. But one thing you need to be very, very careful of, and I will try and be very quick on this, is if these are minimum wage people, be ever so careful, because one of the last companies in the world that I would expect to have fallen foul of the minimum wage regulations was John Lewis, the John Lewis Partnership, and they had a practice of averaging workers' payout over the year. And what they found is, because the minimum wage, I mean, they did pay the minimum wage rate to people over the entire year, but because some people worked more hours in some months than others, in the months when they were working lots of hours, which is the relevant pay period for determining the national minimum wage, the hourly rate had actually fallen between the minimum wage. So they've just taken 36 million off their predicted profits because they're worried about how much this is going to cost them. So I think that's one for a discussion with us, to be honest.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a few more. We will respond to you all, and we'll come back to you directly as soon as we can.
Brilliant. I think on the helpline, what we do learn is there's no such thing as an easy question. There are always things to consider on all of these things. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us. We do hope that you enjoyed this webinar. Slides and a recording, as Sue said earlier, will be available shortly, so do let us know if you'd like a copy. And next month's webinar is very snappily titled. It's planned to be on data protection and the new GDPR. We'll try and make that as practical as we possibly can, and at the moment we're expecting to run that on Tuesday the 20th of June, but we will be sending out details about that nearer the time. So hopefully you'll join us in the future, and have a good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.